Well, good morning. Well, last week, wasn't it nice to have a missionary come in and speak? It's a treat, right? And if you didn't catch that, you can always catch that on the Facebook page. You can go back and watch any of our services from the past there. So, if you didn't get to hear Dwayne, go back and watch it. I know I always appreciate getting to hear missionary stories and what they have to teach us about the Bible and Jesus and reaching others. But today we're going to continue our way through the Old Testament. And we find ourselves back in 1 King this morning. We're going to be talking about the kings. Surprise, the book is called 1 Kings. We're going to be talking about the kings, Elijah, and God's faithfulness in an unfaithful world. So I always like to do a refresh of what we've covered before, so that way if you're just joining us, we're not just starting in a random place in history and you're like, I don't know what happened to get us here. So let's go back through some main events so that way you know where we're starting today. When God had provided the promised land to the Israelites, for quite a while, God was king. And the Israelites had no formal monarchy like the nations around it had. And God spoke through the prophets to the people, and at difficult times a judge would rise up to help the people navigate that tricky situation. And then it would go back to God being the only formal king. However, after some time, the people really wanted a king against God's wishes. The prophet Samuel warned the people of what having a king would be like in 1 Samuel 8:11 through 18. He said, "Here are the policies of a king who would rule over you. He will conscript your sons and put them in his chariot forces and in his cavalry. They will run in front of his chariot. He will appoint for himself leaders of thousands and leaders of 50s, as well as those who plow his ground, reap his harvest, and make weapons of war and his chariot equipment. He will take your daughters to be ointment makers, cooks, and bakers. He will take your best fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his own servants. He will demand 1/10 of your seed and of your produce of your vineyards and give it to his administrators and his servants. He will take your male and female servants as well as your best cattle and your donkeys and assign them for his own use. He will demand 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will be his servants. In that day you will cry out because your king whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will answer you in that day." But the people still wanted a king, and a king is what Israel got. So first there was Saul, who started off following God, and then over time, strayed away. So God had Samuel anoint David as the next king. David, who had his problems and deeply sinned, still did his best to follow after God with all his own heart. And so God promised David that he would have a descendant on the throne for as long as they followed him wholeheartedly. And both Saul and David led during tumultuous times filled with war and change that established Israel as a solid nation in the ancient Near East. And the sons and daughters were conscripted into the military, as Samuel had warned. And David's son Solomon was the next king, and he got to lead Israel during a time of peace. And when given the chance to ask for anything, Solomon asked God for wisdom to rule his people judiciously, and God granted Solomon as he requested, and more. He built the temple that David had planned. He built himself a palace. He built a fleet of ships. He filled his palace with gold shields, built a gold-covered throne with lions, even gold cups. The temple was filled with gold. You name it, you think of it, it probably was there, made of gold. And he became known for his wisdom, and Israel became a powerhouse of a nation. But somewhere along the line, Solomon started doing things on his own instead of doing things with God. The people became servants of Solomon, building the nation that he had dreamed of. And Solomon surrounded himself with wives and friends that worshipped other gods. He started believing in the praise of other rulers and visitors to Israel, that all of this was of his own doing and not of God's. So by the later years of his life, he turned to worshiping other gods. So with just the first 3 kings of Israel, we start to see some of the warnings of having a king coming to pass. Men had been conscripted into the military to fight other nations and to establish borders and safety. People were brought in to build all of Solomon's building projects. The palace and the officials needed staff to serve in the palaces built. Tax was collected from the people to fund all the projects, and everything that these kings began to do cost labor and cost funds. And not all the funds came from gifts from the outside visitors, and not all the labor came from other nations. It came from the people of Israel. So with Solomon's disobedience of God, by worshiping other gods, we see what God told Solomon that he would do next. In 1 Kings 11, we read this: "The Lord said to Solomon, because you insist on doing these things and have not kept the covenantal rules I gave you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. However, for your father David's sake, I will not do this while you're alive. I will tear it from your son's hand instead. But I will not tear away the entire kingdom. I will leave your son one tribe for my servant David's sake and for the sake of my chosen city, Jerusalem." And surprise, surprise, God allowed for things to play out just as he said. There was a talented servant of Solomon's, and his name was Jeroboam. And late in Solomon's days, he rebelled against Solomon. Solomon's reaction was he tried to kill him. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt and took refuge with King Shishak until Solomon died. And I'm going to apologize in advance. If I mispronounce any names, we're just going to go with it, okay? So King Shishak of Egypt. And Solomon's son Rehoboam, he was a son of one of Solomon's Ammonite wives that God had not wanted Solomon to intermarry with due to her allegiance to false gods. He became the next king. And at the beginning of Rehoboam's reign, the people sent Jeroboam before him. So we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Rehoboam, Jeroboam, okay? And Jeroboam went on behalf of the people. They were stating that they had worked too hard under Solomon to build everything that he wanted, and they're asking for a little bit of a lightening of their burdens going forward. Rehoboam asked for a couple days to think about this, and then Jeroboam came back asking for an answer. And to put this kindly, Rehoboam had no mercy. He responded that he intended to make those days of Solomon seem easy for them, and that he was going to make it even worse for them now. If they felt pain before, they're going to be in the hospital now. So, that's a great response from your king, right? The people revolted at Rehoboam's answer, and the Israelites returned home, and they made Jeroboam king over Israel instead. They left the one tribe of Judah for Rehoboam to continue to rule over, and the 10 other tribes went with Jeroboam. Just keep in mind the 12th, I know we have 10 and 1, and we know there's 12 tribes. The 12th tribe, the Levites, did not have specific land. So I'm guessing they were mostly just scattered among, okay? So for clarity's sake, going forward, we're going to have Rehoboam on my right, okay, ruling one tribe of Judah, and Jeroboam ruling the 10 tribes of Israel on my left, okay? This starts the beginning of our divided kingdom, which just means from now on, we have 2 kings to talk about at any given point in history, okay? So over here, of course, we're going to talk about Rehoboam. Rehoboam is now angry at losing power over a majority of the tribes, okay? And he gathers troops to attack the other 10 tribes of Israel. But Shemaiah, a prophet speaking on behalf of God, convinced Rehoboam not to attack Israel. And surprisingly, Rehoboam actually obeyed God in this instance. And here is where we get to see God's response to Solomon and his disobedience played out. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, had a majority of his kingdom removed from him by one of Solomon's servants. But this is also where we get to see God's promise to David kept as his lineage is still on the throne. And we can't cover all of the details of what each king in this divided kingdom, did. But we're going to catch a few highlights as we work our way through the next couple of chapters, okay? So on the left here, or my left, Jeroboam, this is Israel here, he was not loyal to God. He was not faithful to God, not even close, okay? He did not want the people of Israel to be able to travel to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and have their loyalties turned back to King Rehoboam when visiting the temple. So in order to protect his kingdom and remove the possibility of lost loyalty, Jeroboam decided to create 2 golden calves, and he told the people to worship these because they were the God who brought them out of Egypt. He created a high place with priests who were not Levites and started a festival to worship these false golden calf gods. And of course, God wouldn't like such a thing. So he sent a prophet to confront Jeroboam about his sinful ways and the consequences that would follow this path. And as a sign that this prophecy would come true, in 1 Kings 13, 3-6, we see the altar would split open and the ashes will pour out. When the king heard the prophet's message that he had cried out against the altar in Bethel, Jeroboam took his hand from the altar and pointed it, saying, "Seize him." The hand that he had pointed at him stiffened up, and he could not pull it back. Could you imagine that? You just stick out your hand to threaten someone, and then because you did so, your hand just no longer can move. Quite amazing there. Meanwhile, the altar split open, and the ashes poured from the altar in fulfillment of the sign that the prophet had given with the Lord's message. The king responded to the prophet, "Seek the favor of the Lord your God and pray for me so that my hand may be restored." So the prophet sought the Lord's favor, and the king's hand was restored as it was at first. And even after this miracle and others, because this isn't the only thing that God did, and when God spoke and said this is going to happen, and then it happened, or if you do this, then there's going to be this consequence. This isn't the only miracle in Jeroboam's life, but Jeroboam, he did not change his ways, and he continued to worship false gods and fight with Rehoboam over his 22-year reign. So back in Judah, we have Rehoboam, son of Solomon. Also, he did evil in the Lord's sight. He set up high places for worship of false gods and committed and allowed all sorts of horrible sins similar to the nations that God had driven out from the land before Israel. And a few years into Rehoboam's reign of Judah, King Shishak of Egypt attacked Jerusalem and took away all the treasures that Solomon had made for the temple and the palace. This included those golden shields that I still don't know why we had so many golden shields, but they're gone. And Rehoboam didn't have the funds to replace or the power to retrieve all the items that he had lost. So he settled on making bronze shields to replace them. And then he set up guards to actually use the shields now to protect what was left of the temple and the palace. And Rehoboam ruled in evil ways, unfaithful to God, for 17 years before passing away. So at this point, we have an evil king of Judah and an evil king of Israel. Next on the throne of Judah was Abiah. He was son of Rehoboam, and he only ruled for 3 years in an evil way, following the same practices. And he was at war with Jeroboam constantly before he passed away. So then we have Asa. He's the next king of Judah. He's the son of Abiah, and he was different than his father. And he was different than his grandfather, Rehoboam. He got rid of the idols. He removed his grandmother who worshipped idols from power. And Asa was wholeheartedly devoted to God. He brought back the holy items into the Lord's temple, and he lived a long time as king of Judah, living faithfully, serving God. So now we have a faithful king of Judah and an unfaithful king of Israel. However, 2 years into King Asa's reign in Judah, we have Nadab. He's the son of Jeroboam. He became king of Israel over here. And he served in evil ways just as his father had done. And, he only ruled for about a year when Baasha assassinated him and took over as king of Israel. And Baasha wiped out all of Jeroboam's remaining family. This is a lovely line, succession of kings, right? We're so kind to each other and ruling so well, right? So Baasha, of course, he was an evil king of Judah. He was not Judah. We're going to get this right here. He was in... No, he was king of Israel. We are going to get this right. There's a reason I'm doing the left and rights here between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. So Baasha ruled over Israel for 24 years. He was unfaithful to God, and he spent his entire kingship fighting with faithful King Asa. They're constantly at war with one another. So when Baasha died, his son Elah became king of Israel, and he also was an evil, unfaithful king, and he only ruled for 2 years until one of his military leaders named Zimri conspired against him and killed him. And Zimri wiped all of Baasha and Elah's family out of existence. So then Zimri took over as king of Israel for a whopping 7 days. While a majority of the army was elsewhere. They were deployed out. So when the military got news of Zimri's assassination of Elah and his self-appointment as king, the military decided, we're not going to serve Zimri. We're going to make our military commander Omri king of Israel instead. So then Omri laid siege to the town that Zimri was in, and Zimri unfortunately set the palace on fire and died within. And that ended his really long 7-day reign of Israel. So, of course, now we got military leaders in charge of Israel, and Omri became the next king of Israel. There was some power contention there. There was another person that wanted to take over as king named Tibni, and Omri's supporters took out Tibni, so Omri remained as king. Okay? And Omri was not faithful to God. Shocker. He ruled about 12 years in a very evil manner before passing away. Okay, and just in case we're losing track here, side note, Asa, king of Judah, is still alive, and he is serving God. So if you kept track, that is five evil kings of Israel in a row, just so far during King Asa's lifetime. Okay? So 38 years into King Asa's rule of Judah, we get King Ahab of Israel. That is Omri's son, so the military leader's son, he became king of Israel next. And Ahab, he did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all of those before him. And if you listen to the list of things the kings did before him, you're kind of wondering, how can this get any worse? But it did, surprisingly. He married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, who we're going to hear about more next week. And Ahab worshipped the false god Baal and set up a temple and altar for him. He also worshipped other false gods like Asherah and generally angered God with his horrible behavior and his encouragement of his people to do the same. And this is where a prophet named Elijah shows up to speak with King Ahab of Israel. Okay? And he says in 1 Kings 17:1, "As certainly as the Lord God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there's going to be no dew or rain in the years ahead unless I give the command." Right? So now we have a prophet showing up on the scene saying he can control the weather on behalf of God, speaking to a king who believes in no power of the true God whatsoever. And of course, Elijah left King Ahab on God's instruction and was to hide out in the Kerith Valley near the Jordan River. He drank from the stream, and God provided a miracle of ravens bringing him bread and meat each morning and evening. And God was faithful at a time of Elijah's need. You know, King Ahab was pretty angry because a long drought began just as God had said. And even the stream that Elijah was drinking from began to dry up until it was completely gone. So God instructed Elijah in 1 Kings 17:9. He said, "Get up, go to Zarephath in the Sidonian territory and live there. I have already told a widow who lives there to provide for you." So Elijah did as God commanded and traveled to where he found a widow at the city gate gathering wood. He asked her for a cup of water to drink. Think about that. He asked her for a cup of water to drink in the middle of a drought. I understand why I asked, but yeah, I don't know if she had it, right? But she went to retrieve some. And as she went, so she's walking away, he's like, "Hey, can I also have some bread?" You know, in a drought and a famine, water and bread are pretty scarce, right? So we get to hear her response in verse 12. And she says, "As certainly as the Lord your God lives, I have no food except for a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. Right now, I am gathering a couple sticks for a fire, and then I'm going to go home. I'm going to make one final meal for my son and myself. And after we have eaten that, we are going to die of starvation." Wow. You know, God had sent Elijah to someone without a source of income since her husband had passed and with a child to feed in the middle of a famine when they have basically nothing to eat and no hope left. But we believe in a God of miracles, that the unlikely can provide for someone, right? We couldn't have picked someone less likely from outside standards to be able to provide for Elijah than a widow with no income, no food, and no hope. We keep reading here, and it says, Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go and do as you planned. But first, make me a small cake and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son, For this is what the Lord God of Israel has said. The jar of flour will not be empty, and the jug of oil will not run out until the day the Lord makes it rain on the surface of the ground. And she went and did as Elijah told her, and there was always enough food for Elijah and for her and her family. The jar of flour was never empty, and the jug of oil never ran out, in keeping with the Lord's message that he had spoken through Elijah. And God faithfully provided through this miraculous means in order to honor this woman's trust and to provide for his prophet Elijah, all in order to show his sovereignty to Israel, which is amazing, that in the middle of the hardest time, God showed himself faithful. And you know, sometimes we can forget the miracles that we live day to day, that food is on the table and we are provided for. So a little after this miracle was happening, that widow's son became ill, and so ill that he could not breathe. And you know, the widow panicked. Of course, her son is dying. And she was wondering if any of her sins was causing her son's death. Elijah took the boy and prayed over him that his breath would return to him. And the Lord answered Elijah's prayer. The boy's breath returned to him and he lived. The widow's response to Elijah presenting back her living son was, "Now I know you are a prophet and that the Lord's message really does come through you." This widow was already living a miracle every single day through the flour and the oil replenishing. But sometimes those everyday miracles of God's faithfulness are easy to miss after a while. And this big miracle from God opened her eyes to the miracle that she and her son were living. This faithful miracle from God of that flour and oil being provided and her son being well went on for 3 years of famine and drought. You know, after 3 years, everyone is pretty desperate, okay? And the Lord had told Elijah to start his journey back to King Ahab of Israel. So Elijah set out. At that time, King Ahab had sent out one of his servants, as a palace supervisor. His name was Obadiah, something similar to that. He was this palace supervisor. He was a devout servant of God. And he was sent out to scour the land looking for any springs, to find any water source and grazing land for the herds so they would not have to kill off their animals. Now I just want to give a side note about Obadiah real quick. Obadiah was a courageous man of God in King Ahab's evil palace, okay? He hid 100 prophets of the Lord and fed them during this time in order to protect them from Ahab and Jezebel, who were killing all of the Lord's prophets off because they're mad at Elijah, okay? So, but Obadiah did what King Ahab had requested, and he went out looking for water and grazing land. And guess who he runs into? Funny how God works, right? Elijah, of course. And Elijah asks Obadiah to tell King Ahab of his return, but understandably, Obadiah was concerned as Ahab had been searching in vain for Elijah for years, and Obadiah's life would be on the line if he gave this news and Elijah did not appear today. However, Obadiah did as Elijah asked, overcoming his own fears for his own safety. And Elijah met with King Ahab of Israel as he promised Obadiah. In 1 Kings 18, 17 through 19, we read, when Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is it really you, the one who brings disaster on Israel?" Elijah replied, "I have not brought disaster on Israel, but you and your father's dynasty have, by abandoning the Lord's commandments and following Baal's. Now send messengers and assemble all of Israel before me at Mount Carmel, as well as the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who Jezebel supports." And I don't really understand this, but King Ahab did as Elijah requested. And all of the false prophets came, as well as an audience of all of Israel's people at Mount Carmel. And Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long are you going to be paralyzed by indecision? If the Lord is the true God, then follow him. But if Baal is, follow him." But the people did not say a word. Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but there are 450 prophets of Baal. Let them bring us 2 bulls. Let them choose one of the bulls for themselves, cut it up into pieces, and place it on the wood. But they must not set it on fire. I will do the same to the other bull and place it on the wood, but I will not set it on fire. Then you will invoke the name of your God, and I will invoke the name of the Lord. The God who responds with fire will demonstrate that he is the true God." And all the people agreed that this will be a fair test. All right, so this is what happened. Elijah let the Baal prophets go first, as they had the majority, and they got the best pick of the bull. The Baal prophets took their bull, they prepared it by cutting it up, and they prayed to Baal from morning to noon with no answer. And about lunchtime, Elijah decided to mock the prophets. And we see in verse 27, he says, "Yell louder. After all, he is a god. He might be deep in thought, or perhaps he stepped out for a moment, or has taken a trip. Perhaps he is sleeping and needs to be awakened." And this version doesn't say this, but there's some notes that he might have said that maybe your God is in the bathroom. Yeah, it's one of the options of translation there. Maybe your God is sleeping, maybe he's in the bathroom, maybe he took a trip away, and maybe he's just not listening, who knows? So the prophets yelled louder, and they performed all of their religious rituals they could think of, which involved cutting open their skin and bleeding everywhere. But there was still no response from Baal. There was no sound. There was no fire. Nothing was happening other than a crazed frenzy of the prophets. And finally, towards evening, Elijah decides to take his turn. I don't know what he did for the rest of the day other than, wearing everyone else's patience out by letting them watch the scene. But he decided it's time to repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. And around this altar, he dug a trench. That's unusual. Altars usually don't have trenches. He arranged wood for the fire. He prepared the bowl, cut it up, and placed it on top of the wood. And once everything was ready, he asked the people to fill 4 water jars in the middle of a drought that's so severe that there was barely any water. So, we're just going to take water and we're going to pour it on the wood. And, they did it. They took 4 jars of water, poured it on the wood. Once they had done so, he asked them to do it again. 4 more jars of precious water in the middle of a drought. Okay? So they did. And he asked them to do it again. And they did. We're talking 12 jars of precious water covering the wood and altar, so much that it filled the trench that he had made. This is like the dumbest thing I can think of in the middle of a drought. Let's just pour water on the ground. You can't retrieve it again once it soaks into the dirt. Like you take drinking water, you pour it in the dirt. It's going to take some good technology to get that water back, okay? When it was time for the evening offering, Elijah the prophet approached the altar and prayed, "O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, prove today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all of these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are the true God, and that you are winning back their allegiance." Then the fire from the Lord fell from the sky. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the dirt, and licked up all the water in the trench. And when the people saw this, they threw themselves down with their faces to the ground and said, "The Lord is the true God. The Lord is the true God." The Lord, the true God of Israel, showed his power to his people. Elijah had the false prophets executed for leading the people astray, and that evening, God sent a rainstorm on Israel, ending the drought and the famine. It's miraculous. The kingdom of Israel underwent a series of unfaithful kings, but God was not unfaithful during this time. Regardless of the king's actions, God showed up faithful to individual people like the widow. He had faithful people like Obadiah serving him even in a wicked king's palace. He still had messengers like Elijah to bring the truth in a time when they were being hunted down and killed. And God was faithful to show up in a big way when his people were desperate for the truth. God's faithfulness, it's not just for the good times when Solomon was gaining everything he could ever dreamed of. God's faithfulness was still faithful in a world of unfaithful kings. God's faithfulness was still true in a land of famine and drought. God's faithfulness was still present when the false voices outnumbered the true ones. God's faithfulness extended 1,000 years until the time they sent Jesus to mankind. And God's faithfulness is still faithful in our unfaithful world today. God's faithfulness is not changed by our world's kings and their actions. God's faithfulness is not changed by our personal sins or triumphs. And God's faithfulness will still show up today in times of prosperity and in times of need. We read from King David in Psalm 36:5, "Your love, Lord, reaches to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the skies." Let's pray this morning. God, we are so thankful for your word, that you thought so much of us in our modern age, that you know that we would need these stories written in the Bible for us to understand your character, to understand how your faithfulness is constant. Lord, I just thank you so much for all the promises that you give us in the Bible, that we believe that they will come true just as you promised, because you have shown yourself faithful over and over and over. Lord, I just thank you for your faithfulness in our lives today, that is not dependent on who we are. It's not dependent on our status. It's not dependent on the world we live in and what our leaders are doing or not doing, but that your promises hold true even when we are unfaithful, even when our leaders are unfaithful, even when our family is unfaithful, even when we have walked away, your promises still hold true. God, I just thank you. We cannot thank you enough that we always have you to rely on because you cannot be unfaithful to yourself. In your name I pray. Amen. Well, thank you for coming today. I hope you are challenged and encouraged today. And no dinner church on Tuesday, but we'll see you all next week on Sunday. Thank you.